Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kazimir Kekelka, and I'd like to welcome you all to a MacMillan webinar. I'd also like to thank Mondadori for helping us to organize this. This afternoon, we've invited my friend and colleague, Richard Twigg, who I think everyone here probably knows, or almost everyone. He'll be talking about motivation learning with a bit of neuroscience, and anyone who's ever worked with teenagers, I think, can understand the value in that. So I will be ducking out here in just a minute, but I'll come back in towards the end, Richard. And if there are any questions, we can perhaps talk about them.
Fantastic.
Okay, wonderful. So enjoy.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much. Repeat what Kazimir said. Thanks to MacMillan and thanks to Mondadori for organizing this webinar. So I hope you can all see my screen. As you can see, and as Kazimir said, we're going to talk about motivation and learning, and I'm going to touch a little bit on neuroscience and how that impacts or impinges on some of the motivation and learning, and hopefully that will make things a little bit clearer. Hopefully, I'm not going to go into too much neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am a neuro-language coach, so that's why I'm just going to dabble a little bit on that side. So first things first, let's have a look at this quote from Alexander de Haye, which I find is pretty true. It's pretty real. I'll let you read that. But all too often in education, we tend to do it the other way around. We tend to try and fix the flower, and we don't do anything to the environment to try and make it better, more conducive, more motivating, etc. So that's something that we can look at in this session. So I would like you to think about this question. You can obviously put your comments in the chat. What kind of things motivate you to get up in the morning? So you're happily lying in bed. What is it that encourages you, motivates you to get out of your bed first thing in the morning? And I'm going to have a quick look and see if anybody, we've got some good afternoon comments coming through, but any comments that you would like to make regarding what motivates you to get up in the morning? Is it work? Is it a cup of coffee? Is it the kids? What kind of things motivate you to get up in the morning? It's a new day. Nice. Okay. Nice weather. Good. Okay. Having breakfast. I like it. Okay. Work. Okay. Work. Yeah. A lot of people, we are kind of forced. We have to get up. We need to go to work. Sometimes we want to go to work, but sometimes it's things that are put on us. Okay. Doing something that I like. Okay. Family and work. Okay. So we'll come back and we'll let those messages keep flicking through. So, but let's look at these questions now. With that in mind, what motivates you to get up in the morning? Let's look at these questions. How would you define motivation? What is the motivation? Can we come up with a definition? Can we come up with a short slogan or something? And I want you to start thinking about that and possibly put into the chat what is motivation. Obviously, we don't need a long explanation, but in a few words, in a sentence, maximum a couple of sentences, what do you think motivation is? That back up there. Okay. So how would you define motivation? Something that makes you move on and even further. Okay. An engine. Okay. Interest, participation. A reason to do something. the level of drive we need to do things. Okay. The driving force. Okay. Something that makes you alive. Okay, good. Okay. Something that stings you into action. Okay. Any more coming through? Okay, let's go back. Let's have a look at these then. So these are some quotes that I found. Again, I will let you read them rather than me reading them out to you. The drive again here. And we've got this desire, this push, this will that we want to achieve a particular goal and outcome. Could be to get up to enjoy that wonderful breakfast that people have been talking about. Getting up to enjoy doing the job we like doing. Okay. So purpose, we want to go on a holiday, we want to get to the airport on time, etc. Okay. Another slightly longer explanation. Again, we've got the word driving forces. But I think the interesting thing here is that it's a crucial element, according to this quote, in both setting and attaining an objective. Because if we don't have an objective, whether we are teachers or whether students have objectives, we can't then achieve those. But it's also interesting that it fuels competition and sparks social connection. But the contra side to that, the sad side of that is that its absence can lead to mental illness such as depression. If we're not motivated, if we don't feel that we have a motivation to get up in the morning, to do something, to live, to go forward, to advance. In extreme cases, it can lead to depression, unfortunately. So now I'd like you to think of a goal, any goal that you have, objective, okay, something you'd like to achieve. I don't know, going on holiday, earning more money, being happier, losing weight. You guys can think of whatever this goal might be. And then I would like you to think about how motivated you are to achieve that goal. And give yourself a rating out of 10. So you've got an idea, you want to do something, and then give yourselves a rating. You don't need to share it in the chat, but just think about how motivated you are at the moment to achieve that goal. Okay. Whilst you're thinking about that, and be honest, maybe you're a 10, maybe you're 11, maybe you're a 12 out of 10. Some people might be a 5 or a 6. Might be, yeah, I want to do it, but all too often we say that the mind is willing, but the body is less willing to do exercise or to do something. Sometimes it's just we lack that extra little spark. So we've looked at the scale of 1 to 10, how motivated you are. But now we need to ask how or what would make that score higher? How could we increase? What would increase that score? If we've got a 5, how can we make it a 6 or a 7? If we're an 8 or a 9, how can we make it a 10? What can we do to push ourselves higher up that scale? And I think this is also interesting because we need to ask, when we're teaching the kids, what motivates them? What is their reason for learning? Why? If we can get them motivated, get them engaged, get them interested, because a lot of the time they're forced to do things. And we can try and get them thinking for themselves. I like to sort of say that if we imagine how things would be different when you achieve that goal, is that the spark? Is that the impetus that helps us to push that to the next level? I keep going back to this wonderful idea of waking up to have breakfast if you are kind of less motivated, but if you think, wow, I'm going to be full of energy, I love the smell of that coffee, I'm going to bounce out of bed and I'm going to go and have that breakfast because I'm looking forward to it. So sometimes if we look just from where we are to the goal, sometimes it's less motivating than look the other side and to say, wow, if I pass this test, or if I do that, or if I achieve that, how wonderful I'm going to feel, or how my life is going to be different, or how things are going to be different when I achieve that goal that I've set myself. So we're looking from the future, looking back, and hopefully that is the kind of the pull, the desire to help us, or the drive, not necessarily driving us forward, but using a pull to pull us towards achieving that goal. Might well be something that's just another way of looking at how we can motivate ourselves to achieve those goals or objectives that we have set. So looking specifically at learning English, we are all English teachers. We're all, if I presume you're all English teachers. If you're not English teachers, you are teachers of maybe another language, or you're aspiring to be teachers. But we need to think about what motivates someone, in our particular case, our students, to learn English. Well, in my opinion, there's a couple of things that could affect their motivation. One could be that they're being forced. They're being forced by their parents. In this case, it could also be with older students. If you are working in a private language school, or you're doing private lessons, it could be that the employer has told this person, English is the language of communication. You need to learn English because we're dealing with other companies, with other countries. But it's not been their choice. It's been imposed. It's been forced on them by somebody else. And that might be what affects the motivation, because they don't feel that they've bought in. They're forced. They feel that they've been told to do it. It's not something they've decided to do themselves. Another thing is that we all know ourselves that we've all been students. We've all had to learn something when we were at school. Some things we liked, some things we didn't like. And we all have bad learning memories. A teacher that we didn't like their teaching style. We didn't find them engaging. They didn't make the subject interesting. We've all had, even as teachers, sometimes it's the reason that some of us went into teaching is because we felt that we wanted to right the wrongs that happened to us, or we feel motivated to share our experience with others. But students all come with what we call baggage. They all come with their own bad learning experiences. Maybe they were taught in a particular way and it didn't resonate with them. Another problem, and I come across this quite often, to be honest, is self-confidence. A lot of people don't believe in themselves. They don't believe in their ability. They look at their English level and possibly they compare it to their mother tongue. So you get a student who is very coherent, able to converse very well in Italian, and they say that they want their English to be the same. And you sort of say, but you're at the top end of your native language, and now you're trying to compare yourself to the average Italian or the average teenager. And then they suddenly say, wow, okay, my level is not so low. There's not such a big gap. And sometimes that can help spark them and get the motivation going, because otherwise they feel the gap is unreachable, unachievable, but making it a little bit smaller and getting them to work on their self-confidence. And that's also something that we look at a little bit with neuroscience a little bit later on. So when it comes to motivation, as some of you are probably already aware, there are basically two types of motivation that we have to deal with. One is intrinsic, coming from inside, and the other is extrinsic, coming from external factors. So if we look at those two individually, we notice that intrinsic motivation, as it says here again, I will give you a bit of time to read it. Okay, so the breakfast could well be that it's because it's fun, it's challenging, it's something that you get satisfaction out of it, out of eating that breakfast. It could also be external, but I would say it's possibly more intrinsic. So we do it for the inherent satisfaction, that satisfaction we get as a result of doing that activity. We're not doing it for anybody else. Nobody's forcing us. It's all coming from inside, and intrinsic motivation is, dare I say it, the most rewarding, because we are driving ourselves towards that goal. We are motivating ourselves towards achieving that particular objective. Extrinsic motivation, we are doing it in order to achieve something else. It's a stepping stone towards another goal, another objective. If I pass this exam, then I'll be able to go to university. If I pass this exam, then I will get better marks, better grades, or might get my parents off my back because they'll stop bugging me and pushing me potentially to get better grades or better marks. So there's always a second step involved. And obviously, if we're talking later on, if you talk about a career, but we can also liken this to our students, there can be some kind of financial gain. Maybe if you do well in your exam, your grandparents give you a bit of money, or they buy you a nice present, or you get some kind of benefit, or you get some kind of perk. It could even be that you, in this case, you don't avoid getting fired, but you avoid having to repeat a year. Those could be the intrinsic motivational factors. But they are harder to control. The intrinsic ones, we've got more control, and we can use those. But obviously, we've got both sides pulling and pushing us and driving us towards achieving our goal or objective. But there is the flip side, the other side of motivation, and there's 4 areas that we need to look at here. One is what's commonly known as the curse of knowledge. The other one is that rewards do not always work. There's always the fear of failure, and we know that that's certainly a factor that can be demotivating. And this is where a bit of the neuroscience comes in, the link or the similarity between emotional pain and physical pain. And we're going to look at all 4 of those individually. So the curse of knowledge, and I think that this is something that as teachers, we possibly need to be more aware than sometimes we are, that we have reached a superior level of knowledge, because if you can teach somebody something, your level of knowledge and understanding of that topic is vastly superior, because you have had to understand it, internalize it in such a way that you can then impart that knowledge to somebody else. So you are naturally more knowledgeable in that subject. But unfortunately, sometimes we can lose sight of how difficult it was to reach that goal. And this, I think, is also where I stand on the side of saying that just because you are a native speaker, a mother tongue speaker of a language, doesn't give you the right or doesn't qualify you to teach that language. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that. And unfortunately, we still have an issue in Italy where, people are talking about mother tongue teachers and there needs to be a mother tongue project, etc. But I think that a teacher is a teacher, and a good teacher will always be a good teacher. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a better or worse teacher if they're not mother tongue. But I think that a lot of time, the teachers that have gone on the same journey as their students, So an Italian teacher who has learned the language, they know what it's like. They know how difficult it is, and they know the pitfalls, and they can empathize a lot more with their students and help them and support them. Whereas sometimes the teacher that hasn't gone through that journey sometimes doesn't understand how it can be difficult, or we reach that goal, and because we've reached the top, we forget how difficult the journey was. So sometimes it's a case of just going back and say, okay, it might be simple, it might be obvious for me, but that doesn't mean that it's obvious for the other person. So I need to find possibly 2, 3 different ways to get the message across, and not just say it's this way, this is how it is. If it doesn't work for you, then I'm sorry. We need to find different avenues or different ways to get our message across to the students. And so because of this curse, we say that our knowledge is cursed. And so we've kind of got the super knowledge, and we find it difficult then to impart and to put ourselves in the state of the listener, in their state of mind, and understand what it is that they're finding difficult. And this was from a book, Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. Rewards don't always work. This one always puts a smile on my face, because I remember as a child, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well, that, we were always given some kind of reward, whether it was a financial reward or whether it was something, a treat, sweets, biscuits, I don't know, something. There was always something that was, you were told, if you study hard, you'll get a good job. If you study hard, you'll get a good mark in the exam, and you can go to university, etc. If you do well in the test, I'll buy you X, or if you behave, then you can watch a movie, or you can stay out late with your friends and not have to come in. But unfortunately, sometimes these work, and we know that they can work, and they can be motivating, and they can be an old carrot and stick. But other times they come with a bit of a burden, and they don't always motivate in the way that they want to motivate. Sometimes they add extra burdens. And unfortunately, sometimes then if something is difficult, or the student or the child is finding it difficult, they then sort of say, oh, it must be me, it must be, I'm not so clever, I can't understand this, so I won't get a good job, or I'm never going to get that toy or that prize, or why should I bother trying? And they start to lose motivation because they feel that the task is unachievable. So they can have the adverse effect and start to make it become demotivating. Fear of failure. As human beings, we all have this innate fear of failing, not getting something right, making a mistake. And as we get older, so this fear becomes more apparent, it becomes stronger. And obviously the fear of failure amongst peers, amongst our fellow classmates, can sometimes be overwhelming. But when we can keep it in check, it's possible, because it can lead to a motivating factor. It can lead to use stress. It can be something that we can harness, and we can use it to push ourselves forward. But it must be kept in check, because if it gets out of control, then we start to fear this, and it becomes sort of overwhelming. And the most important thing is, as I said here, that if it becomes paralyzing and isolating, we then sort of draw into ourselves, and we're worried about taking that next step because of making a mistake, getting it wrong. And as teachers, again, we need to be very conscious that our words and our actions can be isolating without meaning to be. So if we kind of are too quick to criticize, to correct, to show displeasure, that can sometimes lead the student to then be frightened of trying again a second time, a time afterwards, because they've been kind of isolated amongst their peers, and they have this innate fear that's difficult to overcome. So when we look at, and the last point I've kept purposely till the end with the brain and the physical and emotional pain, because I need to explain a little bit about how this all fits in together with the brain. So motivation and the brain, I thought we would have a look at. So in our brains, we have an area called the amygdala. And the amygdala, if you guys can see, I'm not too sure if I'm close enough to the camera, but you imagine if you've got your hand up and you put your thumb towards your palm and you close your fingers over your thumb. So I'm making a fist, but I'm making a fist with my thumb inside, covered by my four fingers. This little almond-shaped thing in the middle is called the amygdala. And this is something that is crucial to motivation. And normally it's calmly covered up, and it sits in the middle of our brain, sometimes referred to as the lizard brain, sometimes referred to as the chimp. There's a very good book called The Chimp Paradox. And it's a brain that dates back, part of the brain that dates back from a long, long time ago. But the amygdala is very, very important for motivation. Okay. And when the amygdala is stimulated, it sends a signal from the prefrontal cortex, which is the front of our brain. And this is the part that stores information for our memories, helps us processing information, deciding what we should respond to, what we should ignore. Okay, the rational part of the brain at the front. Okay. And it sends us information backwards and forwards to our long-term memory, and we get information from our memory and brings forward, I did that in the past, that happened. And so the information flows backwards and forwards in our brain, and we then make that decision once we get that stimulus from the amygdala. So in order to understand how this all fits together, we need to look at four main parts of the brain. So we've got the prefrontal cortex, we've got a thing called the hippocampus, and we've got another thing called the hypothalamus, and obviously finally the amygdala. Okay. So if we look at an image, we can see where these various parts are. So prefrontal cortex here at the front of the brain. Okay. Sorry about the others, but it's just to give you a context of where they are. Then we have the hippocampus just underneath the amygdala here. Hypothalamus here, and here you can see this amygdala sitting right here in the middle of the brain. Okay. So we're going to look at the various parts and what their functions are when it comes to memory, learning, etc. And we'll come back to looking at the importance of the location of these four parts of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex, used for focusing our attention, front of our brain, where we're going, what we're looking at, focusing in, getting things, thinking about what we want to do. Okay. We also use it for predicting the consequences of our actions. So this is kind of our rational brain, sometimes referred to. So if I do this, past memory, what's going to happen, go back into my memory bank, see what happened, and I can kind of work out from past experiences and what I've got to decide if I should or shouldn't do a certain thing. So we can use that part of our brain for what we call rational thought. We can also anticipate events, again, based on previous knowledge, information, etc. And we'll look at a little bit of how this develops and works with the prefrontal cortex, front part of our brain. Okay. It also controls impulse. So if we buy or do things on impulse, it's all being dealt with by the front part of the brain. Okay. It also manages our emotional reactions. Okay. Moving on to the hippocampus. So the main things I wanted to focus on here was that the hippocampus is involved with memory, learning, navigation, less important, perception of space or space perception, less important. But those two, that the hippocampus, where it is sitting in the brain, is linked with memory and learning. So we need And bear in mind, remember, it was after the amygdala, so behind the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and then we had the hippocampus. So memory and learning is a key factor there. Hypothalamus, regulating your body temperature, synchronizing your sleep patterns, controlling hunger and thirst, but it plays a role in some aspects, again, of memory and emotion. So if the temperature is too hot, if we're not sleeping well, those kind of things, if we're hungry, if we're thirsty, this is going to have an impact on our memory and our emotion. And we know that if we are hungry or thirsty or too hot or too cold, we don't concentrate as well as we should do. And that's where the link comes in, that starts to affect our memory and emotion. It will have an effect on that as well as how we feel. The amygdala. The main function of the amygdala is to regulate emotion and memory. That is its principal objective. Okay. But it's also associated with the brain's reward system, stress, and in addition, the fight or flight. So if we go back to when in the past we were hunter-gatherers and we went out there and we saw a lion, it was then a case of, do I fight or do I run away? And it was that immediate response. And that response came from when we perceived a threat. The threat doesn't necessarily have to be real. It is a threat that we perceive as a threat. And that's where it comes back to the lizard brain, the chimp part of the brain, that people start talking about the sort of the old part of the brain where we were using the brain with that basic fight or flight. And that was the survival response. So when we look now at both social and emotional pain, they've done quite a bit of research using what they call an fMRI, so a functional MRI, where they've checked parts of the brain that light up, parts of the brain that are activated. And when people feel emotional pain, rejection, happiness, sadness, etc., the same areas of the brain are activated, is activated, when people feel physical pain. And this, for me, when I heard this, was quite an eye-opener, quite a shock. And the more I thought about it, the more it made a lot of sense that if you have, in the past, it used to be sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never harm me. I think that is very untrue. And I think sometimes words can be more harmful than physical actions because of the emotional nature of the words. And sometimes those words cut deep when people say things to you. Sometimes they linger for longer. I unfortunately had a kind of a first-hand experience of this. My mother, she's since passed away, but she had Alzheimer's. And I remember in the early days when she had Alzheimer's, and she came to stay with me here in Turin, and her short-term memory was not very good. And so she would forget things pretty quickly. But I remember saying something to her and being possibly a little bit aggressive or a little bit unkind in what I said to her. And I walked out of the flat to take the dog for a walk, and I thought, it will all pass and everything will be okay. She forgets things in 5 or 10 minutes, unless it's longer-term memory and she's tapping back into longer-term memory. And I came back after 20 minutes, and she still spoke about, or she still remembered what I'd said, or she made some comment. And I realized that those words, the emotional pain, stayed with her longer than something that had no emotional connection. So sometimes when we're trying to get students to remember things, to motivate students, sometimes if we can get them to link it to an emotion, doesn't have to be a negative emotion, it can be a positive emotion. it can also sometimes aid in their memory and recall of things if they associate a particular feeling or emotion with a word or expression. So the other thing that they looked at and they realized was that some of these regions were activated when people experienced an experimental social rejection. So if we think about kids at school, kids will be kids, teenagers. One day you're my friend, the next day you're not my friend, and sometimes they feel rejected, they feel left out. Sometimes that pain can be the same as if they have been physically harmed or physically hurt. That kind of rejection can have the same kind of effect. And the reason I'm talking about this, we'll look at it because this affects our motivation, our ability to be relaxed, calm, and to learn. So what happens when the amygdala is overstimulated? We said that the amygdala needs to receive some kind of signal, some kind of information, and then we make the decision. But if we have what we call an amygdala hijack, this is described as an emotional response that is, first of all, immediate. There's no delay. It happens in a millisecond. It is overwhelming. It takes over everything that you're doing, your thought process, everything. You are just taken over by this immediate emotional response. And the key thing is that it is out of measure with the actual stimulus that triggered it. Okay. So whatever's triggered this emotional response it's out of context because it's triggered an emotional threat. So we feel emotionally challenged. And I use myself as an example, and I'm sure a lot of you can think about it. You're driving along, or your husband's driving along, your boyfriend or whoever it might be, and everything's calm and everything is okay. And then suddenly somebody cuts in front of them, somebody, I don't know, doesn't indicate, does something, and they suddenly, from being this calm, normal person, suddenly they are red with anger. The air is blue because they're swearing and they've lost it, and they get really, really angry. And you just kind of, what was that? It was literally 1 second to the next, normal person to this person losing his temper, etc. And unfortunately, it tends to be mainly men that respond as quickly as that. But, you know, when you think about it, and then it takes some time, and in that moment, they can't think of anything else. Their brain is completely taken over by that emotional threat that they feel emotionally, whether it's a threat to their maleness or whatever it happens to be, a sense of being in control. But it is, and I'm sure you guys can think of an occasion when that has happened. Some people refer to it as like you've got a chimpanzee in a cage and the chimpanzee is just going absolutely crazy. Is another way, or the lizard has just kind of gone berserk in your brain. So, and this was come from a guy called Daniel Goldman talking about emotional intelligence. So, if the amygdala senses physical, emotional, or social uncertainty, what happens is that it fully focuses on the threat and it engages all of the brain's energy. So all the energy goes to fighting, the flight or fight response. What am I going to do? There's no rational thought. Everything is focused on the amygdala. And no other thinking or normal thinking, straightforward thinking can take place until the amygdala has rested or gone back to a state of rest. You can't do anything. So if I go back to this picture before, and if we look here, so here we've got the brain that I said, we've got the prefrontal cortex, we've got the amygdala in the middle, hypothalamus, and the hippocampus all being involved with memory and learning, etc. If you can see this lightning bolt that I've put down here that comes up from the amygdala being hijacked, we've basically put a block between the front part of the brain and any back parts of the brain. So no information can flow front to back. Everything is focused around the amygdala. Okay, so we've completely been hijacked, and we need to calm down. We need to get the brain into a state of calm before we can move on. So that's something that we need to be aware of when we start thinking about students with emotional and social pain. Just some brain chemicals. We're not going to go through all of them, but obviously the brain needs a little bit of dopamine. Dopamine was the happy chemical, motivation, learning, pleasure. Oxytocin, giving a feeling of trust, motivates you to build relationships. Serotonin, the calming, feeling significant or important. It's the calming force. And then the endorphin, which is this euphoria, and sometimes endorphins we get to mask the physical pain. Okay, so those are the sort of the brain chemicals that we need to keep the brain healthy. And we need a balance of those. We don't want too much of one and none of the other. Here, I just put this in just to show basically that in the brain, we've obviously got a lot of neural networks or neurons. And the information is flowing around the brain. Hippocampus here, amygdala here, and the information is flowing red and blue, going in different directions. Serotonin pathways are the red, the dopamine pathways here happen to be in blue, but just to show you that the whole time information is going backwards and forwards. So if this amygdala has been aroused or over aroused, basically we're going to block any of the flow of this information and the chemicals that are moving around the brain. So what's this all got to do with us as teachers? So what's the link between the brain and learning? So children from the age of 0 to 7 do not have their prefrontal cortex developed. Okay, so they learn by repetition, they learn by doing, and we call this implicit learning. So everything is done without the prefrontal cortex. Then from the age of 7 onwards, the prefrontal cortex starts developing. We start developing critical, logical, analytical skills, and we start learning through association as well as implicit learning. So we start to get explicit learning. Okay, so we've got a mix between the two. Okay. Adults can engage in both explicit and implicit learning at the same time because we've fully developed our prefrontal cortex. So in the time the prefrontal cortex is developing, as I said in the beginning, we don't have repetition learning by doing. Then we start to use it, and only in adults, when we become adults, do we actually have the ability to engage with both of them. So, teenage brain, what is it about teenagers that makes them difficult to motivate, difficult to control, difficult to engage? Well, they've done some studies, and they basically sort of said that at one point they thought that early 20s was the time that the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, was fully developed. It's not true. They've discovered that it's actually only in our early 30s that the brain is fully cooked, or whatever expression we want to use. So we've got this period of continuous development going through in the middle, the teen years, when the brain is still not able to use the implicit and explicit learning. So as we said, adults think with the prefrontal cortex. We use rational, logical, analytical thought. Teens process information with the amygdala. So everything is done on emotion. So whether it's positive emotion, physical, whatever kinds of emotion they're using, that is where they process the information from an emotional point of view, not rational, logical. And because in the teenage brain, the connections between the emotional part of the brain and the decision-making are still developing. So they haven't created this ability to be able to process, analyze, decide how to deal with it. So everything is taken from this emotional part. And as we know, the teenage brain is constantly hungry for stimulation and is easily bored. Okay, I think possibly nowadays they tap into it more, but when I was a kid, before there were video games, etc., I remember as a teenager always sort of saying, "Oh, I'm bored, I don't know what to do," and having to find things and you know, going to my parents and sort of saying, "What can I do? I'm bored." Okay, so I know that as a teenager, we have this tendency to be bored. But teenagers are also primed to learn very quickly. But addiction is also a form of learning. We can easily get addicted to things. So addiction to video games, addiction to social media, addiction to other things. And unfortunately, they can also get addicted to drugs and substances that would later on in life become less likely to become addicted to. But we've got this addiction, I think, a lot of the time. Video gaming, gambling, use those similar reward circuits. And so they use those to get them engaged, to get them using video games and other activities that in the past weren't there, because they want them to be hooked, to use the materials, etc. So we know that they can be easily hooked, but we need to get them hooked on the right kind of things. We need to get them stimulated in the right areas. So what can we do to get these kids involved, hooked, etc.? Well, in my opinion, if we can personalize the learning, if we can make it applicable to them. So if we look at the link between personalization and motivation, we get the individual's intrinsic drive and engagement. So, and the key thing here is, obviously it works in marketing, customer service, but if we can get them engaged in the topic, if they feel that what they're talking about has meaning, has purpose for them, it makes it more real. Okay, and obviously, whatever we do, we're going to lead to increased motivation, increased interest in the topic, and we know with emotional learning, we can have a positive effect. We can remember things more if there's an emotional attachment. So if we look at how course books tend to include personalization, so one example that I decided to take here was to take the upskill course book, and things like this that sometimes we might take for granted, but this is where we can really use these opportunities. You know, what do you think? Getting them to engage and to give their opinion, their thoughts, to answer these questions. Did you volunteer anywhere during the summer holidays? Yeah, and to get them talking and explaining and expressing something that was close to them, that had meaning for them. It's going to encourage them to speak more, to use the language that they know more. Or something like peer review, listen to your classmates and answer the questions. So I'm listening to, actively listen to what they say, to be able to then, which key phrases they use. I'm starting to use interest and listen from that point of view. So I see that there's a benefit for me in listening to them. Imagine what other members of your family are doing at the moment, and write 5 sentences about them. Not write 5 sentences about an imaginary person, your own family, somebody who's close to you that's got some kind of emotional attachment. Again, what do you think? What are the best inventions in history? Explain why. Why do you think this, in your opinion, explain the best inventions and why you find them interesting? So do you get some kind of emotional involvement, so we get the emotions in with the motivation? So I'm sure that there have been a number of issues that you have had, but I would just like to leave towards the end with some thoughts that you could start thinking about, some issues that you've experienced with motivating students. I'm sure some of them have worked, some haven't worked, but maybe think about, with this extra information, that worked because of that, or maybe if I tried that might work, or maybe there's a different way of looking at it. But thinking about the things that you've done when you're motivating students, and don't reinvent the wheel. That worked, so let me try it again. And maybe it didn't work with those students. Why? Try and find out, maybe there was less emotional involvement, or maybe they were overloaded, maybe they were tired. Could be a number of factors that could possibly be playing into the whole mix. So think about what worked, what didn't work, and is there anything that you have thought of trying but you didn't have the courage? We've got this fear of failure. We think, maybe I could try this, and it won't work. Yeah. So sometimes we also as teachers need to sort of say, hey, let's give it a bash, let's try. If we don't try and try it and it fails, okay, no problem at all. We say to our students, make mistakes, learn from your mistakes. So we could also sort of say, okay, that didn't work this time, let's find out why. Let's try another way around it to see if there's a way to get it to work and to motivate our students. So the bit of neuroscience that I'm going to leave you with is, I've mentioned a little bit about neural pathways and neuroplasticity. I'm going to talk to you now, and about Hebb's law. So basically in our brains, we have these pathways, and I like to think of it as two fingers touching together. There's a couple of videos that I will leave for you. You've got the links that you can watch them on your own. They take you to a YouTube video, and they explain about somebody who's practicing to throw basketball. In the beginning, you need muscle memory. You start doing something, and it's like you make one connection. And if you do it once, you make a connection. And this is what Hebb's law is, that he says that neurons that fire together wire together. So they fire and then they wire and they make a connection. But the problem is that if we don't use that connection and that pathway, we don't then make it stronger. The more we use it, the stronger we make it, the more neurons that fire together. So as they say in the video, you start out, maybe it's with a little path through the forest. The more you do it, it becomes a stronger path, and it becomes a road, and maybe it becomes a highway. And with that, once you've made a connection, if that connection is wrong, we can't just break the connection. What we have to do is we have to create a new connection, make that stronger, and then eventually this connection basically falls away by itself because the other one takes over and it becomes stronger. So, and we know that the brain is very plastic. We can learn new things. It's not a case of after the age of 30 we can't learn anymore. We've stopped learning. The brain is plastic. We can learn new things. We can learn new skills. We can train the brain. The more we use it, the stronger it becomes. So the more we can get these connections going. And if we can link, like we do quite often, we link back to previous knowledge. The brain and human brain likes to learn things with connections. So if it can connect it to something that they learned previously, we've got a link there already, and we can strengthen that link. So I'm going to skip over these two videos. So as you can see here, there's the neuroscience of learning, which you can click on and look at that video. And you've got a video on Hebb's law, which explains a little bit about the theory of Hebb's law. So there's some information here for you on training, which is made to measure for you. And I would just like to thank you very much for your time. I've left 5 minutes or so in case there are any questions, which Casimir very kindly has been looking to see if there are any questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them.
Okay, that was very interesting. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I've seen a couple of questions here, and I would encourage anyone to add their questions. We still have a few minutes. The first one that, while we still have people here, is just about, and you might have made reference to this already, but do you have something that you could direct them to in terms of like articles, books? I know you said you had 2 YouTube videos you mentioned, but is there anything else you could give them to continue this research on their own?
Yeah, if they're interested in Rachel Paling, who I mentioned a couple of times, has written a couple of books on brain-friendly learning. There's also a really interesting book written by Steve Pinkers on the chimp paradox, which is quite a good read, which basically explains the amygdala and how it works. Dan Goldman on emotional intelligence. But there's a lot of stuff on the internet, but I think that Rachel Paling's book on brain-friendly grammar and brain-friendly learning is kind of written as from a teacher for teachers, which I think is quite nice.
Okay, thanks. And I'm looking many other questions except for, again, just some additional references that they could pursue in their own time. So if there are no further questions, I think we can wrap it up. So anyway, thanks again, Richard. That was very interesting. And any final comments you'd like to make?
I'd just like to thank the audience, because I've just noticed here a lot of people are writing with thank you comments, and I'd like to thank them for their time.
We do have one final, sorry to interrupt you, one final question from Annie Mazzocco, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah. And then one from Paola, just in the final 2 minutes that we have you. Annie would like to know how come amygdala hijack has become more and more noticeable. And then there's another one about if you could repeat the name of that book, which you mentioned.
Absolutely. I think, to be honest, I think it's like anything with science that as we try to explore, and the brain is something that's quite difficult to study. And this the fMRI has only come out in the last 10, 15 years, possibly maximum 20 years ago. So I think it's as they start to try to understand the brain more, they've been delving deeper and sort of discovering these things that were there, but we just didn't know really that they existed. And for a lot of time, people just believed that the brain, we stopped learning. And a lot of people think, oh, kids, if you don't have a kid's brain, you can't learn because we're not as spongy and have the same information. But I think slowly but surely people are starting to realize that that's not the case. So I think it's just with time and science.
So we understand the human mind a little bit better than we used to, in other words.
Yeah. I still think we're a long way off really understanding it, because I think it's a complex beast. But I think that's a lot of information. And the name of the person about the brain-friendly learning was a person called Rachel Paling, P-A-L-I-N-G.
P-A-L-I-N-G, Rachel Paling. Okay. Paling. Okay, wonderful. So thanks for those questions. And I think that's probably about all the time we have today. So neuroscience is a wide field to cover, especially in 1 hour. So afternoon, and we'll see you again soon. Richard, thank you. And thanks again to my colleagues make this possible.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your time, guys. And
bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
MacMillan, thanks a lot. Take care.